Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming today. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Social Science Department. This is our second annual Women's History Month Symposium. And I'm pleased today to introduce Professor Gillian Hendershot. She is a visiting professor of European history at GVSU. Now, just to give you a little bit of information about her, so you know her before she gives the presentation. She had her BA with honors in history at the University of Strathclyde. Strathclyde? Sorry, Strathclyde. Her MA in history from Central Michigan University in conjunction with the University of Strathclyde. And at present, she's a PhD candidate in history with fields of European history, gender history, ancient Near East, and Mediterranean history at Central Michigan University and the University of Strathclyde. She is currently working on her dissertation. The topic is Witches, Wizards, and Marginalized Men, Gender Accusation and Conviction in Witch Trials in 17th Century England and Colonial New England. She is, right now, she has a publication getting ready to come out called Salem's Other Invisible Crime of 1692, the link between witch trials and domestic violence, and it's a journal article that's going to be published in Gender and History. And she's also currently working on issues about gender and the use of torture during witch trials. And so we welcome her today. She's presenting a paper titled The Pitfalls of Female Leadership, the Power and Subversion of Gender Identity in the Careers of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I of England. Please welcome her.
All right, thank you to GRCC for inviting me here today. So I spent the last 10 years studying witchcraft, so today we're talking about female queens because, you know, the two topics are very closely intertwined, not even a little bit. But what we're going to be looking at today is issues of power and issues of gender identity and how they impact women, specifically in the British Isles, more particularly in the case of Mary I of Scotland. She's much better known as Mary, Queen of Scots, and then Elizabeth I of England. And what we're going to look at is the fact that I think it's fair to say that most people know that in the 1500s, ideas about women were extraordinarily different to how we think about women today. Women were ordered, or they were expected to be submissive, they were expected to be well-behaved, they were expected to fulfill very certain, very specific roles within their societies and within their communities. They were expected to be quiet, meek, they were expected to do exactly what their husbands told them, and beyond all else, they were expected to have lots and lots and lots of babies. And that was really how people thought about women in the 1500s. For the most part, people thought that women were not really capable of being good leaders. In fact, there was a very clear philosophy that if there was a woman put in charge of anything, it wouldn't work out. It would be a disaster, it would be a complete mess, and it would never be fixed until a man came forward and fixed that problem. So the reason why we're going to look at these two particular women is because they're very good examples of the problems that women faced for a huge number of different reasons. First of all, both women were incredibly famous in their day, even before they become queens of their respective countries. They're both from incredibly well-known, very powerful, very, very wealthy families. Even though they come from these very well-connected families and they both inherit their leadership positions, both women are regarded with suspicion. Mary, Queen of Scots in particular, was regarded with revulsion by the other members of Scottish society. And both women were still expected to fulfill very certain, very specific obligations of womanhood, even though they were from these very powerful, well-connected families. And in the end, Elizabeth, during her reign, doesn't live up to these ideas about womanhood and what's expected of women. She does not marry, so she's not ever subservient to her husband. She never has any babies, and in that sense, she's a very successful ruler. Men eventually come to respect her, even though throughout her reign they pressure her to live up to these standards of women. She never does it. She never fits in with what's expected of womanhood, and that's what I would say accounts for her extraordinary success. Mary Queen of Scots, on the other hand, just like Elizabeth, was challenged, she was ordered, she was begged, bullied, however you want to describe it, to have children, to have a husband. And again, just like Elizabeth, she's faced with the problem of if she has a husband, she's going to immediately become subservient to that husband, and she actually does what the members of Scottish society want from her. She gives in and she marries someone, and that marriage proves to be her undoing. The very same people who pressure her into getting married use that marriage to denounce her as, at various points, they call her a whore, they call her a prostitute, they force her out of Scotland, all because of her marriage, which originally they had forced her into. And this is the problem for women. If they conformed to the ideas about gender, the ideas about how women should behave and how they should interact with other people, that marked them out as women. It marked them out as weak individuals, people who could not be trusted, people who didn't really live up to good standards. They were always contaminated with original sin and all of these different problems and negative ideas that people had about women. But if they don't follow gendered expectations, people might find that very strange, but ultimately they do come to respect those women. And these are the themes of gender and identity that we're going to look at. And I think, or at least I hope, that you'll notice some parallels to modern society. Women who want to become successful politicians, or at the very least work in the political world, whether as politicians or assistants, usually have to, not to overly generalize a very complex issue, but I'll do it anyway, they tend to subvert their feminine identity. And what you tend to see, again, it's not an absolute, there are women who buck this trend, but if you look in America or the British Isles or anywhere else in Europe, most women who are politicians all seem to come from this sort of cookie cutter line of women. They're generally a little bit older. They've usually got, very short hair, and they always wear their snappy pantsuits in various different colors of blue and black and brown and so on and so forth. And that's something that many people find acceptable, but for the most part, women who do not conform to those gender ideals in politics, even today, don't tend to have nearly such a successful career as other people who do conform to those gender standards have. And that's going to be what we look at today, how each of these women either achieved and maintained or lost her power because of the way that she conforms or subverts her gender identity. And another couple of things that are important about these two women. First of all, they're cousins, so they're a very good comparison because they are related. They do come from the same family. And then also, they're two women that I think have been very frequently written about in historical literature, particularly historical fiction. And there does seem to be a lot of misunderstanding about both Elizabeth and about Mary. So where we're going to start out is by looking at what Europe was like in the 1500s. We'll do a little bit of background information, look at what people thought about women, what's actually taken place in European countries, and then we'll maybe also look at some issues related to gender, what people thought gender was, how people understand gender, and different assigned gender roles. But between 1500 and about 1650, for a fairly complicated series of political circumstances, or because of a series of political circumstances, multiple different European countries really for the first time, have women in control of them. In fact, it's an unprecedented number of women who have control over different European territories. And this was a phenomenon that a lot of men in Europe were incredibly concerned about, because it added fuel to a long simmering debate about what the proper role for women in European society ought to be. And the very fact that you have all of these women spoke volumes to many men that there was a problem in European society. And many men called this, and it was supposed to lampoon women, they called it a gynecocracy. In other words, they were not so much mocking, but they were showing their concern that women were in charge of these countries. On the left, we have, that's Mary Tudor. She was Elizabeth I of England's older sister. She was a queen who spent most of her reign desperately trying to have children with her husband. It was not particularly successful, and it seems to consume her administration. Because of that overwhelming concern, she was not particularly well regarded by her subjects. People don't seem to appreciate her rule. I mean, she does also kill thousands of people, or is responsible for the death of thousands of people, and her reign was seen as an enormous failure. The woman on the right is called Mary of Guise. They're all called Mary for various reasons, but Mary of Guise was the mother of Mary Queen of Scots. And while Mary Queen of Scots was a baby and a small child, her mother actually ran Scotland on her behalf. And again, she's not a particularly popular figure. Most people thought that it was incredibly inappropriate that a woman was running this country when there were so many good men who could take the position that she was holding. There's enormous rebellions against her administration, and it ultimately results in a huge war that breaks out in Scotland. Catherine de' Medici was similarly not a queen in her own right, but she was the regent in France at this same time period as well. And up at the top is Anne Boleyn, who of course was Elizabeth I of England's mother. She, again, not actually a queen in her own right, but she did exert enormous political influence. She was a very powerful individual. She is largely responsible for England changing its religious allegiance, and she's another example of an incredibly outspoken woman who didn't really fit in with standard gender beliefs and practices. All throughout this, when all of these different women, whether it's Mary and Mary, Catherine, Anne Boleyn, while all of these women had enormous sway and influence, men were horrified by this trend in leadership. Many of them started to portray Europe as being under siege or plagued or facing an untold crisis of epidemic proportions, that all of these women had somehow managed to wrestle control and take command over different European territories. Some men portrayed this in very religious ways, claiming that it was sure evidence that God had somehow abandoned or left Europe to its own devices, and that's how women were able to get control. Others portrayed it as these women were in league with the devil. Others portrayed it as symptomatic of larger problems in European society. There's lots and lots of examples of men who do this, but the one that we're going to be concerned with today is a man called John Knox. John Knox was an exceptionally anti-fun member of the Scottish society. He was a minister. He was actually a Calvinist minister, and he absolutely hated women. And he particularly hated the fact that women were in charge of all of these different countries. And he publishes a pamphlet, the front cover to the original version is there. It was called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. And it's a diatribe against Mary Queen of Scots and Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's older sister. And in this book, he claims that God hated women being in charge of anything, that God had deliberately intended that women would always be subordinate to men, and that God would not tolerate women being in charge of any given country. And he's very, very outspoken in his statements about both Mary Tudor and Mary Queen of Scots. And he plays a very important role in Mary Queen of Scots' career in particular, because while she was Queen of Scotland, he was an immensely popular firebrand preacher. The picture up at the top, it's a little bit fuzzy because the original version of it is very fuzzy as well. But up in the top right-hand corner, you can see John Knox is actually using his position as a minister. He's out in his pulpit and he's denouncing Mary Queen of Scots, solely because she's a woman. And this was something that he did very, very effectively. He spends a lot of time railing against Mary Queen of Scots, and more people start to listen to him over the course of her administration in Scotland, and people do become very openly critical of her because John Knox is stirring up all of this controversy. But he hates women, and that comes out very, very clearly in the book that he writes. The other picture on the bottom left actually is a very famous scene from Scottish history, and in 1563 John Knox shows up at Mary Queen of Scots' palace, and he publicly berates her for her policies, for her personal conduct, for her relationships with various different people, and he shouts at her for so long and so publicly that he winds up making her cry, and it's a very famous moment in Scottish history. And that's actually a stained glass window representation of this, because it was seen as a very great thing for John Knox's cause that he managed to humiliate Mary Queen of Scots in this way. But in any case, one of the things that he says about women is that God, by the order of creation, has deprived women of authority and dominion, for who can deny it is repugnant by nature to allow a woman to have succession? And he is very clear in this idea that he has, that women absolutely should not have any kind of power or authority. And the reason why he has this belief and this idea about women is largely because of the gender ideas and sexual identity that existed in the 1500s. And it's a fairly complicated thing to understand gender ideas. In the 1500s, most Europeans don't really have a lot of scientific knowledge yet. A few people are starting to learn more about the human body through dissection, although technically speaking, dissection and examining cadavers is still illegal. But a few people are starting to do it. But most people still use very, very traditional sources to try and understand the differences between men and women. And the two sources that they use for the most part are two ancient authorities: Aristotle, who's a very famous philosopher, and Gillian, who was a very well-known and respected, if you want to call him a medical practitioner, such as it existed from the ancient world. And both of these men had written extensively about what it was that made women different to men. And both of these men thought that women were actually just lesser men, that somehow their plumbing, if you want to call it that, had gotten caught inside their bodies, and that's why women were inferior to men, that their penis, that their testicles was still inside their bodies. But reproductively, both of these men believed that women were biologically identical to men. It was just that their penis and their testicles was still inside them. And that's how people understood the differences between men and women. Women are just these lesser men. It was still really, really common in the 1500s for people to use words like testes, semen, sperm in describing female anatomy. And the reason for this is it's fairly convoluted, and it seems, I think, fairly infantile to us, but people believed that the human body was governed by what they called humours. And humours could either be hot or cold, they could be wet, they could be dry. Women's humours, because of the nature of womanhood, tended to be very cold and very wet. And this was why people thought that women's penises and testicles had never descended, because anything that is cold tends to contract, it tends to tighten, and people believed that because women were these very cold, very humid creatures, that the penis and the testicles had basically sort of retracted into the body, and that's what explained the fundamental difference between women and men. This picture here, again, it's a little bit fuzzy because it's a very, very old picture, but it shows this image. You've got at the bottom, it's a man and his reproductive system, and up above you have the female equivalent, and it's kind of hard to see here, but this is actually the female penis as they represented it in the 1500s, and people thought that women did have this inside their bodies at all times. And because of the differences between men and women, men had this dry heat that made them external, at least in terms of sexual organs. And this meant for most Europeans that gender was a very fluid concept. And we tend to think of people in this time period having very rigid ideas about gender. And in terms of gender roles, they certainly were very rigid. But in terms of biological sex, the ideas that people have in the 1500s are much more complicated than I think we usually give them credit for. I mean, we also should not give them credit because their ideas are ludicrous and very, very wrong. But they do have this very fluid understanding of gender. For example, most people thought that because women are cold and wet, they're internal, their sexual organs are internal. But if a woman started to exhibit too many masculine qualities, if she behaved in a way that was considered typically male, you know, if she was out in public, if she engaged in sporting activities or did any of the very stereotypical masculine things, she would become, by virtue of that, a man, more or less. And this is actually a medical treatise from the 1500s that explains the phenomenon of the man-woman, a woman who would spontaneously, all of a sudden, wake up one day and she would have a penis. It's not really clear what's actually taken place. There are actually lots of accounts from the 1500s, the 1400s, the 1300s of women, particularly or young women during puberty, who would wake up one day and all of a sudden they would have male genitalia. You know, we could probably understand it in a couple of different ways. Either it's the sort of equivalent of an urban myth or a legend. People start to believe and think that this is true, this is happening, and the story spread. Or it's something else, some kind of medical condition like a prolapsed womb or something of the sort. And people with their very crude understanding of gender start to think that maybe these women are developing male genitalia. But if this is the case, if women, by being too public and too strong and too powerful, could suddenly turn into men, by the same token, men could turn into women. And this is another medical treatise that deals with the so-called womanish man, a man who during the course of his life, because of his activities, the fact that he was not behaving the way a man was expected to behave, he suddenly becomes female. Most of the time, people think in the 1500s that this can only be done surgically, that a man actually has to go through the castration process before he can become the so-called womanish man. But again, just like with women, there are all of these incredibly bizarre reports that spring up from time to time that detail men who could allegedly start lactating, men who breastfed, men who at one point in their lives did lose their genitalia through some spontaneous natural phenomenon. And people thought that this kind of thing was men suddenly turning into women. So the fear that a lot of people had was that if women start to take on leadership roles, they're going to become the masculine figures. They're going to be the people who run society. And to that end, if men are no longer needed to be political leaders, to be social leaders, then they will start to become the women in society. And there's a really overwhelming fear among some men in society that this is what's happening with this gynecocracy that's growing up, all these female leaders, that men are somehow being supplanted and they're going to wind up being the subservient group in society. So in that sense, this single body type was something that men were incredibly fearful of. And again, this picture is from the 1500s. And again, it represents this fear that people have. And it shows that there's allegedly this very fine line between being a man and between being a woman. And if you don't fit within your proper gender identity and the proper gender bounds, then you could lose your sense of self, your sense of gender. And this was made all the more complex because of the other dangers that women held. And men also frequently talked about the dangers of what I've called here public women. And this is, again, something that is very frequently alluded to in the literature from the 1500s. It's something that seems to have preoccupied artists, poets, other types of literary figures. And it was something that people thematically keep coming back to. And if a woman was allowed to become too vocal, too critical of regular society, then disaster was surely going to follow. The figure on the left in this picture is a representation of this. This is actually a picture called The Angry Wife, and it's from a larger series called Scenes of Daily Life that represented all different kinds of gender ideas. And what you have here is the common housewife, and she's abusing and beating her husband. She's actually using a household device called a spindle to do it, and she's being egged on by a demonic figure that's sort of pushing her towards this very non-traditional feminine role. And she's been so powerful and she's so strong that over in the bottom corner, it doesn't really look like it, but that image here down at the bottom is supposed to represent the man's pants. And pants were the ultimate symbol of masculine authority. Men were the ones who wore pants. Men were the ones who were in charge of society. This woman has become so powerful and so dangerous that she stripped a man of what defined his masculinity, his clothing. And this was something that was portrayed in a very humorous way here, but it does speak volumes to an overwhelming fear that men have in European society, that if women are allowed to take on these leadership roles, then they are going to lose what is essentially theirs, their masculine identity. The picture on the right is what they thought would ultimately result from this. If women were allowed to continue down this path, they would eventually just abandon all pretense. They would fall into league with the devil. Christian European society would collapse, and men would be left in this state of incredulity and absolute weakness. But for your enterprising man, there was a way to get around this and to stop this from being too big a problem. And one of the things that men could do was prosecute women for a crime called scolding. And this was something that was in the statute books of most European countries, actually wasn't removed from the English statutes until the 1960s. If a woman speaks out too much against her husband or against her male neighbours, if she's publicly or verbally abusive in any way, shape or form, men could prosecute her. They could go to their local magistrates and they could initiate charges against that woman. And this was something that was taken fairly seriously in Europe, and it led to various different types of punishment. The most common was a thing called a scold's bridle. And if a woman nagged too much, she would eventually be forced to wear this device. And it's something that, as you can probably see from it, it's designed to go over her head, and she would have to wear that usually for a period of about 2 weeks for a first offence. And it's got those big ears because she would have to wear it at all times. It was supposed to be a type of humiliation as a type of punishment, because people would be able to see her all over her community and know that she had been prosecuted for not behaving as a good and appropriate woman. The other part of this punishment was the fact that not only is it humiliating in that she has to wear this at all times, but the scold's bridle, as this thing was called, also had a tongue depressor built into it. And when women were convicted of scolding and they wore this thing, they would have to wear the device that held their tongue in place at the same time that they wore this, which made it obviously incredibly painful to wear as well, and not particularly hygienic either, but it's probably not their main concern. So women would wear this for a period of about 2 weeks, but if they were repeat offenders, if they didn't learn their lesson from the scold's bridle, what people would then do is initiate the ducking stool ritual. And a woman who verbally abused her husband, etc., too many times and had been prosecuted multiple times would be subject to the ducking stool, which is fairly self-explanatory. She would be taken to a local body of water and just repeatedly dunked in that water, because people thought that this, again, partly serves as a humiliation, and it's also a fairly brutal form of corporal punishment against the woman. And these are some of the ways that men could, if you like, get back at women and take control over their own lives again. So in this world, and this idea, and this sort of stereotypical idea of gender roles and gender behaviour, in the 1500s, you have the rise of all of these different female rulers. And of course, as leaders, as the primary politicians in a country, it was very hard for men to figure out how these powerful women could actually fit into society, because typically women were seen as lesser men. Women, if they spoke out in public, were subject to these very brutal and very public, very humiliating punishments. And now they're being expected to all of a sudden start respecting these women as their primary political leaders. So we're going to look at two examples, as I mentioned before. First of all, Mary, Queen of Scots. She becomes queen, and she tries very, very hard to live up to traditional gender expectations. And this backfires on Mary, Queen of Scots really, really badly. She ultimately winds up losing her life as a result of this. I think there is a tendency among people to romanticize the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, because her life is incredibly tragic. Disaster after disaster befalls Mary, Queen of Scots. It's almost as if nothing can possibly go right for this woman. And a lot of people, even jaded, cynical, professional historians, have at times fallen victim to the idea that Mary, Queen of Scots was somehow unlucky, or she was ill-fated, or fortune or fate just was out to get her. And I think that that is something that we need to move away from. Mary, Queen of Scots is not just unlucky, and things don't just happen to her. To some extent, she is a victim of her gender identity and her very desperate efforts to fit into standards and expectations for women in the 1500s. But that's not to say that she doesn't make mistakes. She's not just a passive, helpless victim. Mary, Queen of Scots makes a huge number of mistakes in her life. I mean, she does do some incredibly stupid things. But at the end of the day, what happens to Mary, Queen of Scots is a direct result of gender perception. When she comes to Scotland, the leading statesman in Scotland pressure her very, very intensely to marry. And they argue that it's a woman's job to marry and have children and lead a good, prosperous, wholesome life with her husband. And she does this. And it's this, her second marriage, once she's in Scotland, that ultimately leads to her downfall. It ends in scandal and it ends in homicide. And like I said, it's by no means not her fault. I mean, she does play a very active role in what goes wrong, but she is placed in under an enormous amount of pressure. She's more or less forced into marriage, and then that very same marriage is used by the people who force her into it to remove her from power. And the fact that her marriage doesn't work out confirmed people's idea of Mary, that she was a weak individual, that she could not cope with the pressures and the powers of leadership. And then, after her second marriage fails, and we'll talk more about this in a couple of minutes, after her second marriage fails, she's basically kidnapped and she's raped and she's treated incredibly brutally. And when that happens, she's not treated with any real degree of sympathy. The Queen of Scotland is sexually assaulted, and the response of the Scottish people, because they're such a kind, compassionate group of people, is that she's not a victim. She allowed herself to be seduced by this cruel and corrupt man, and that is her own fault. So this third marriage ends with her forced abdication from Scotland in favour of her infant son. A lot of the people who were involved actively in the downfall of Mary, Queen of Scots, people that included her own brother and some of her closest advisors, use her marriages as a means to get rid of her. And in essence, they, like I said before, they start to portray her as a prostitute, they portray her as a whore, and it's not really a fair way to look at the career of Mary, Queen of Scots, because she is just trying to fit into a world where more or less she's an aberration. She's someone who doesn't really belong. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is someone who subverts this gender identity. She doesn't marry, even though, again, just like Mary, she's put under an enormous degree of pressure to do so. And when she doesn't marry, she doesn't fall into this idea that women are weaker, because she does stand separate to the rest of women in society, and the very fact that she subverts her traditional gender role is really what allows Elizabeth of England to be incredibly successful. So if we look in more detail now at Mary, Queen of Scots, she was born in 1542. She was the daughter of James V of Scotland and his wife, Mary of Guise. We looked at her very briefly earlier. Mary was James V's only legitimate child. He actually has an ungodly number of children, but most of them were with his mistresses, and she's the only legitimate offspring. 8 days after Mary was born, her father dies. So at the grand age of 8 days old, she becomes the Queen of Scotland. And that really is what sets her on the path to her eventual downfall, because people were horrified that there was now not just a woman, but there was a baby who was now on the throne of Scotland, a female baby. And people were very horrified by this. And it leads to a lot of unrest and uncertainty in Scotland. Mary's position is so precarious in Scotland that she's actually sent away by her mother to live in France with her relatives. Once Mary is in France, that's a picture of her on the left there. She's about 10 years old in that picture. Once she's in France, the royal family in France decides that it would be a really good idea if the infant queen from Scotland marries the heir to the French throne. And a very elaborate wedding is planned at a remarkably young age. They're both in their early teens when they get married, when Mary, and this is her wedding/coronation portrait, Mary marries the heir to the French throne, who was called Francois. And these two were, like I said, incredibly young, and they don't really have a good idea of what they're going to do with their lives because, they are just young teenagers. But in 1559, just 1 year after Mary gets married, her father-in-law, the King of France, dies, and she becomes the new Queen of France. So she's now the Queen of Scotland, and she's the Queen of France. So this is 1559. And it all happens very, very quickly. Her father-in-law dies, she becomes queen. About 6 months later, her husband, the King of France, gets some kind of ear infection that, again, fairly inexplicably, becomes a very deadly illness, and he actually dies because of this ear infection. And when he dies, Mary, of course, is no longer the Queen of France, and she's basically left homeless. She doesn't have any real authority, power, or money in France, and the only option that's left to her is to go back to Scotland, which she is not too happy about. And this is actually a picture of Mary when she's in mourning for her husband. So eventually she sort of pulls herself together and she makes her way back to Scotland. And when she initially arrives back in Scotland, she is greeted with a fair amount of celebration because she was a tragic figure, she was very well known, and the people of Scotland were quite excited to meet their queen because she's never actually lived in Scotland since she was a small baby. And for about the first 3 or 4 months of her reign, Mary does have quite a good degree of success. She establishes policies of religious toleration. It doesn't matter if you're a Catholic or a Calvinist or anything else. You can worship any way you want. She's one of the few people in Europe who allows their subjects to do this, to worship any way they want. And the people are very happy about that. She also devotes a huge amount of the state's money towards giving charity to the poor. So she's channeling away state funds that would usually be spent on parties and gowns and so on and so forth. She's using that to help poor people in society. And this makes her very, very popular, albeit very briefly. But immediately when she gets back, people start to harass her about when she's going to get married again because, as they argued, this is the job that women are intended for. It's all well and good her being the Queen of Scotland, but her proper feminine role is to be a mother. So people start agitating her, telling her that she needs to, that she has to get married. And she's very resistant at first because she doesn't want to get into another situation where she loses a husband at a young age and has this very traumatic experience. But eventually the pressure is so heavy on Mary, Queen of Scots, that she agrees that she will marry someone. And the person that she chooses to marry is a man called Henry Stuart. He is actually her cousin. Again, all the royal families in Europe are all intermarried to just the most insane degree. I swear to God, they all have tails and things like that. But anyway, she marries her cousin, who's called Lord Darnley, and nobody can really understand why she married him. He was a weak, irresolute gambler. He was, at the very young age of 18, he was a hopeless alcoholic, and he wasn't a particularly gifted or nice or even interesting individual. But nonetheless, she decides to marry him, and it's one of those sort of big historical mysteries about why she does this. There's some speculation that she was forced into it, but we don't really know for sure what happened. But as soon as she marries Darnley, she realizes that all he's really interested in is getting the Kingdom of Scotland away from her. He wants to have control over the entire country, and he's just using her to do this. So she works very hard with her councillors to try and offset the power of Lord Darnley, to try and make him a peripheral figure in Scottish affairs. And he understands that this is what she's doing, and he and his friends become very angry and very belligerent towards Mary, and their marriage is not very happy. Despite the unhappiness, though, she does wind up pregnant. And in the midst of her pregnancy in 1564, Darnley decides that he's going to take matters into his own hands. He's going to take control of Mary and reassert his male dominance over her. And one of the things he was particularly concerned about was the fact that she had a very close relationship with her private secretary, a man called David Rizzio. And David Rizzio was just a figure that Mary could talk to and interact with and converse with. There doesn't seem to have been any scandal involved in their relationship, but Darnley starts spreading rumours that Mary is actually sexually involved with Rizzio, although nobody really believes it. And he decides with a group of friends that he will teach her a lesson. He'll show her who's actually in control of their marriage. So one afternoon, he and this group of friends break into her private apartments and they stab Rizzio about 56 or 57 times in front of Mary. And then at this point, she's about 6 months pregnant, and then they turn on Mary and they hold knives to her stomach and tell her that she's going to be next, that they're going to kill her. And again, historians have speculated, but we don't really know for sure, that what Darnley actually intended was for Mary to have a miscarriage and then to die herself, because she is 6 months pregnant, and in this time period, someone who miscarries at 6 months is most likely going to die from the blood loss, because it's obviously a very traumatic process. Again, we don't really know that for sure, but the very fact that he deliberately chooses to kill David Rizzio in front of Mary and then threaten her seems to suggest that he did want something to happen to her. He obviously can't kill her outright, because that would cause, too many political problems for him down the road. But it does, of course, sour their marriage even further. And after this point, Darnley and Mary don't really have that much interaction with one another. And 3 months later, Mary gives birth to her child, James, who later becomes the King of England and Scotland. But by this point, she is in a fairly desperate state. All of her advisors who had pressured her to marry were now telling her that clearly she had been very stupid and very womanlike, and of course she wasn't capable of running things herself. Her marriage proved that she just wasn't capable of any kind of leadership. She can't even control her own husband. Another group of people at this point decide to get involved in matters. And again, it's not entirely clear how all of this happened, because we obviously don't have full documentation. But a group of men led by another member of the Scottish nobility, the Earl of Bothwell, decide that they're going to, again, make a play to get control over the Kingdom of Scotland and use Mary to do this. And this, again, she has nothing to do with this, but it embroils her in scandal and it embroils her in all this intrigue that she's never really able to recover from. And Bothwell decides that he's going to kill Darnley and he's going to marry Mary for himself. And he plots to do this by putting a huge amount of explosives into Darnley's house. But Darnley, in the middle of the night, hears all of this ruckus and hears what's taking place, and he tries to escape. But when he escapes, he does make it out of the house, but he runs smack into the people who are trying to kill him, and they just strangle him and leave him dead, lying in the middle of the woods in Scotland. So in that sense, they were very successful. But what this does is it casts a very, very poor light onto Mary, because people start to whisper that she was somehow involved in this intrigue, and that it was just very typical of a corrupt, weak woman. What was to be expected of someone who's given all of this power but is incapable of wielding it? She abuses it, she kills her own husband, and she acts very inappropriately. And this becomes, again, even more complex when the Earl of Bothwell, that man in the middle there, kidnaps Mary, and he takes her to his castle that's in a very remote part of Scotland. And there, and again, we don't really know the full chain of events. What we do know is that once Bothwell gets control over Mary, he sexually assaults her incredibly viciously. He rapes her repeatedly, and in her traumatic state, he forces her to marry him. And when he does this, he declares himself to be the King of Scotland, that he is now the husband of the Queen, so he actually has full control and full power. And again, rather than being sympathetic towards Mary's plight, the lords of Scotland, the people who are the courtiers and the ministers, they denounce her activities, and they say that, again, she has behaved most inappropriately and that it's her own fault that she was raped, that she had somehow seduced the Earl of Bothwell into doing this, that her womanly guile and charm had so enchanted him that he had no other option but to rape her, and they are incredibly unsympathetic towards her. But in any case, she and Bothwell, or rather Bothwell, and he kind of forces Mary into it, decide that they're going to go to war against all of the people who are opposed to them. And again, Bothwell persuades or forces Mary to come out and bring an armed force with her to try and quash the rebellion against his administration. And as soon as they get out into the battlefield, again, it's a very famous story, Bothwell tells Mary that he's going to get reinforcements and that he'll be back in a couple of hours, and she never ever sees him again, and she's basically left in the middle of this battlefield facing all of these people who are incredibly angry with her for being raped, and they are determined to take control over her. Of course, again, she's very traumatized, and most historians think at this point that she was pregnant, again due to the rape, and she's captured very, very quickly, and she's dragged back to Edinburgh, the capital city of Scotland. And once she's there, she is imprisoned, she's interrogated very severely. Some historians, again, think that undue force was used against her. And the people of Scotland are outraged by this. Not by Mary's treatment, but by the way that she behaved. And a huge number of broadsides or pamphlets start to be published all over Scotland, which portray Mary as a mermaid, which was the common euphemism for a prostitute. And most people said that Mary, in allowing herself to be raped, because, you know, she just let it happen passively, she really didn't, but that's how people portrayed it, she had sullied Scotland and she had sullied her own reputation, and this is what happens when you let a woman get control over a country. So basically she does everything that she's told, everything that is expected of her, and it still backfires incredibly badly on her because she does conform to feminine stereotypes. She becomes a wife, she becomes a mother, and that, for the Scottish people, even though they had forced her into this, it proves to them that she is unfit to have control over her own country. By contrast, if we very quickly look at the reign of Elizabeth I of England, this is a very different pattern. Elizabeth, just like Mary, had an exceptionally traumatic upbringing. Her mother is executed when she's about 3 years old. She is disinherited. She's declared illegitimate. There's a lot of scandal. There's a lot of uncertainty about her regime and about her administration. And it's a very long, very difficult path for Elizabeth to get to the throne of England, to become the Queen. And she learns from the mistakes of many of her predecessors, in particular her sister Mary Tudor. Mary had become queen and she had ruled very unsuccessfully because she had married a foreign prince. She had married the king of, or the man who becomes the king of Spain, Philip II. And when she does this, she loses control over her own territory. And Elizabeth witnessed this happening. She witnessed all the different ways that women had been treated, the way that they had been brutalized over the course of her lifetime. Her mother loses her life because she's a very powerful, outspoken person, and she sees several other close associates lose their lives for similar reasons. And Elizabeth's greatest feat once she becomes queen is in how she conveys her image as an all-powerful leader. And she does this to a large extent by subverting her gender role or her gender identity. This picture on the left here shows Elizabeth about 10 years before she becomes queen. She's about 16 at this point. And you can see it's a fairly standard picture from the time period, or painting from the time period. She's got the very delicate feminine dress. She's got lots of jewels. There's the big flowing sleeves, etc., etc. And it's just a fairly typical image of a woman from the mid-1500s. It could be used almost interchangeably with many other pictures of different people. The second picture, the one on the right, is Elizabeth 1 year after her coronation. And by this point, the image that she's conveying is incredibly different. It's deliberately masculine. She's got a very masculine type of clothing on. She's got very subdued sleeves if you compare it to the picture from just 8 years previously. And it's very, very similar, very deliberately similar in style and tone to the images of male leaders from England. Just to show you an example, this is her brother when he was crowned as King Edward VI. And this is what Elizabeth very deliberately tries to cultivate, this image that separates her from regular women, women who are different, women who are unique, can somehow survive in Elizabeth's mind. She is repeatedly begged and cajoled to marry by her statesmen. She consistently refuses to do this, largely because she didn't want to give up authority. She didn't want to risk losing control of her crown, and she knew that if she followed standard gender patterns, then she would lose control over her own agency, over her own life. And there's a very deliberate effort throughout the course of Elizabeth's life to try and convey a very clear gender image that was neither typically feminine nor necessarily typically masculine. And she tries to convey herself as something separate, something very distinct. And this is what works for Elizabeth. She very deliberately subverts her traditional gender role. And in doing that, she becomes one of the most popular and one of the most powerful queens that England or the British Isles has ever had. And I know a number of you have to leave at 3, is that right? Okay, so we will wrap it up there and move over to questions. Yeah? All right, thank you.
Okay, who has questions?
If you have a question, wait for the microphone to come around so it can be captured on film too.
I almost hate to ask this. I saw a film about Elizabeth I, and I was struck at one point where she was redefining her image, and she used the word virgin to describe. She said, I am become, it reminded me of Madonna. Anyway, she wanted to be a virgin, and that was the, unmarried, no children thing, which is similar to what you're saying. I hadn't thought about the outfits that she had designed, but is that sexless thing part of her new creation of herself?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the very fact that she doesn't have children and she doesn't behave the way that women are supposed to is something that does give her a lot of ability to maneuver and to deal with men, because they don't necessarily see her as, I'm not saying that they didn't think she was a woman. I mean, obviously they knew that she was a woman, but she doesn't behave in a typical feminine fashion. And in that sense, a lot of men, particularly her own courtiers, were able to respect her in a way that they did not usually respect women. And that was a very deliberate action on her part. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about whether she really was a virgin or not, but it's a whole separate issue, I guess. But she does cultivate that image very, very deliberately, and she claims at various points that she's not married to a person, she's married to her country, she's married to her people. And that is it's very clear propaganda that she uses, and that is part of this image and having control over her own life and her own existence and her own agency. Any other questions?
I have one.
Okay.
I have one too.
All right.
I was wondering, what kind of example can women today take from these two women and their experiences? Professional women today.
I think there's a number of different ways. I don't think that women today should try to subvert their gender identity, but just understanding and being aware that the way that other people perceive them is largely based on cultural traits or cultural tradition, and not necessarily buck that trend or buck that tradition, but just be aware that this is how people have viewed women for a very long time, and that is a long, slow process to change that, and it is possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to forego everything that you are and everything that you want to be, but you can work the system, you can, play it to your own advantage if you want to. The very fact that women maybe still have to do that is kind of sad and probably a whole separate issue in of itself. But Elizabeth is able to very successfully succeed in, phrase I hate, in a man's world, but she does it, and she does it very, very successfully, and she is very much revered as probably the greatest monarch that England's ever had. So if any lesson could come from that, maybe that should be it. Other lessons, maybe, don't get involved with the Scots. I don't know. I mean, that would probably be the biggest thing that you could learn from this. Yes.
I don't want to, dominate the microphone just because I have it in my hand. So do any of you have a question? Okay.
Hi. I was just wondering, when you talked about John Knox, he was a minister, you said, so what did he teach? Like, was he like Baptist or Lutheran?
Calvinist.
Calvinist?
He was actually a very, very close friend with John Calvin. The two men worked together for a very long time. John Knox lived in Geneva with John Calvin, and John Calvin actually saves his life at one point because John Knox, in all of his dealings with the French and with Mary Tudor, has to flee for his life out of the British Isles, and it's John Calvin that takes him under his wing and protects him, and those two men were very, very close friends and allies.
All right, thank you.
Anything else? Yeah.
Hi. Why do you think Elizabeth eventually gave in and had her cousin Mary assassinated or killed?
I don't really think she had that much choice. Mary was, for want of a better word, she was a lightning rod for all of the hatred that did exist against Elizabeth. And just in case you don't know, Elizabeth was a Protestant. She was someone who practiced the Reformed faith. Mary was a Catholic. And as such, a lot of people thought that Mary, Queen of Scots, should actually be the Queen of England and not Elizabeth, because she was of the legitimate line, as many Catholics saw it. And a lot of countries in Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain all wanted to see Mary, Queen of Scots, be the Queen of England and restore it to Catholicism. But anyway, to answer your question, she was involved in a number of different plots, not the one that eventually sees her killed. That was a very fake plot, but she did conspire to marry one of the leading noblemen in England, and she was someone that was a constant rallying cry for people who want rid of Elizabeth. And I think in the end, Elizabeth really had no choice in the matter. Although it is kind of curious, Elizabeth wanted Mary to be, I hate people who do this, but I'll do it, accidentally killed, and they wanted to see her assassinated by, just some random person that would never be found. But she was never able to finagle that and make it happen, and then they had to go with the public execution of Mary. But I do think she had absolutely no choice. As long as Mary was alive, Elizabeth's life was in danger because she was the biggest threat to Elizabeth's administration.
All right.
I have a question. Was there any kind of conspiracy when Mary, the Queen of Scots, got kidnapped and raped by, I forgot his name?
Bothwell.
Yes. I mean, I'd imagine there's a lot of protection around a queen. Is there any theory of an inside connection there? I mean, how do you just march into a castle and kidnap a queen without...
Actually, it happens a lot more often than you'd think. You would not believe the number of times the Pope got kidnapped.
Oh, okay.
But no, a lot of the people who were part of her inner circle allied themselves with Bothwell because they thought they would get more power from it. So there were inside people. But in this time period, in the 1500s, there's not protection for leaders the way you see today. I mean, very often kings and queens would always be publicly available. They'd always eat their meals in public. They would always be very open and very visible to the people. So it was actually very, very easy for people to get access to a king or queen. But there were people on the inside who certainly made it a lot easier.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, if I can ask mine. The last presidential primary that we had for the Democratic Party, you had a really interesting interplay between race and gender, and Hillary Clinton seems to be one of those women who people will sort of push a label on her the way they expect her to behave, whether it's in reaction to the affair that her husband had as President of the United States or her role as a candidate and a potential leader in the world. And I'm wondering how you saw gender as an aspect of this last election, if it is similar to what these women faced.
I think it was a very, very big part. Whether it was similar to what these women faced, I'm not really sure. I think at times, I could be wrong in this, but I think Hillary tried just a little bit too hard to play the woman card, you know, the way she kept alluding to Bill's affairs, or I'm sorry, President Clinton's affairs, or, you know, all these other things. And I do think that hurt her campaign because it just brought up some of those old issues. But I do think she was trying to appeal to female voters who might have been put off by Hillary otherwise, because she does... Again, I'm not speaking from any political point of view, but she does have a reputation for being, I don't think it's unfair to say, fairly abrasive. And I think she was just trying to soften up her image, like, you know, hey, I'm one of the girls too. That was always the image or the idea that I got of Hillary during the election, that she was trying just a little bit too hard to show that she was just, you know, a typical woman, which she's really not. I mean, she does have that very, very public history with President Clinton, and I think that probably hurt her a little bit too. But I think gender plays into the election as well. I think it was 2000, there was a study done, and 8% of the people who were polled said that they would not vote for someone as president just because they were a woman, on the basis that they were a woman. Those are the people who admitted to it. You know, I think a lot of people also found excuses not to support a female candidate. You know, the idea that a woman can interact with Islamic countries, I think that's nonsensical. You know, other countries have had very powerful female leaders, and I do think that gender is still an issue. There is still this idea that a woman can't necessarily control or run a country, and that did come out with Hillary, to be sure. But, you know, she did always wear the pantsuits. How often did you see her with a skirt on during the campaign?
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
I see a lot of the similarities in what you were talking about. It's almost like she can't win in terms of achieving one image or other. You know, if she tries to be more masculine, it backfires, and if she tries to be more feminine, it doesn't seem to work. And it reminds me a lot of Mary Queen of Scots. I mean, you know, she can't find a place, so...
Yeah, and that's a good way to describe it. She's sort of floating, and she can't rest anywhere. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Oh, wait, hey, one more. Okay.
Hi. I have a question about back to John Knox and John Calvin. Do you think that John Knox, when I believe you said that he was preaching that God hated the women who tried to take these positions of authority and whatnot, was that something that he got directly from John Calvin? A principle of maybe Calvinism, or something that you might find in Calvin's Institutes?
I think so. I mean, I don't know whether Calvin, you know, sat down and taught him that, but certainly the Calvinist faith, particularly in this time period, that was a function of it. They had a very clear idea of what a woman's role was, and the idea of Calvinism in the 1500s is that women should be in the household. The role of a woman is to be a mother. That's her primary function in life. So any woman who doesn't do that is someone who's not behaving in a good Calvinist way. But I think probably Knox's bigger problem with Mary, rather than the fact that she's not conforming to his gender stereotypes, is that she's also not conforming to his gender stereotypes and she's a Catholic. It's like the two worst things she could possibly do in his eyes, because he doesn't like women because of their, or that type of woman because of her public behavior, and then also he doesn't like her because she's a Catholic and she's not promoting his ideas and his values.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
All right.
Okay. Do you want? I'm going to ask the head of the social science department to come up and give us a little recap. And first of all, though, I want to thank, again, Professor Hendershot for such a great lecture. So let's give her a round of applause.